I mean, we can't cry about it, right? We have to move on and go play a football game on Sunday.
You're listening to the Huddle Up Podcast with Chad Jensen and Zack Kelberman. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com and sound off. And now it's time to drop some knowledge.
Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of the Huddle Up Podcast, presented, as always, by Mile High Huddle and 24/7 Sports. I'm your host, Chad Jensen. With me, as always, is your Denver Broncos reporter for 24/7 Sports. He is Zack Kelberman. Zack, we've been rolling with the punches. This injury bug, he keeps landing body blows on the Denver Broncos all season long. Body's been dropping. It's like that one song, Let the Bodies Hit the Floor. Like, that's what it's felt like for the Broncos this year. And then we got even worse news on Wednesday afternoon that Emmanuel Sanders goes down.
Yeah, the injury bug isn't just biting, it's destroying anyone in its path right now in Dove Valley. I hate this injury to Emmanuel Sanders. It's one thing for a star player to go down during a game, but to go down in practice running against air, non-contact, that's a brutal blow, and I just hate to see it.
Yeah, we're going to definitely diagnose this thing, dive in, and react, talk about where the Broncos go from here, if they can overcome this loss. But first, we got to say thank you to the sponsor of today's show, Audible. You guys go out and get yourselves a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/huddleup. You get over 180,000 different titles that you can choose from, whether you're on an iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. That's audibletrial.com/huddleup. You've heard us tell you about this now for over a year, or going on a year anyway. It's a phenomenal service, a phenomenal app, especially for those of you who like to consume audio content. You'll love Audible because you can get books under your belt while you're doing other things and multitasking. At least that's how I use it, and I use it literally every single day. So go to audibletrial.com/huddleup, capitalize on that free audiobook. Huge selection to choose from for that free audiobook, plus the 30-day free trial. And then also, if you have not done this, make sure you're following the show on Twitter at HuddleUpPod, especially if you want to get in on the weekly Mile High mailbag, because that's where Zack and I primarily take our questions for the podcast, is from Twitter. Sometimes we take them from Mile High Huddle 24/7 Sports VIPs. Occasionally we'll take them from Facebook, but predominantly we make it about our listeners on Twitter. So if you want to get in on that, go on Twitter at HuddleUpPod, click the follow button, and then just watch for when we tweet out. You know, usually the days we're tweeting is especially on game days, and then anytime a big piece of news, something that we got to react to, like today's news about Emmanuel Sanders breaks, you can look for those tweets. And you don't even have to wait till we start tweeting. You can tweet us any questions at any point, and we'll circle back and address them as often as we can. So follow the show on Twitter at HuddleUpPod, and then also take some time, do your duty as a loyal listener of the show, and leave a creative review. Rate the show, give us a 5-star rating, especially you guys, it's important if you're listening on iTunes or Stitcher. But of course, there's iHeart, there's YouTube, there's Google Play, there's Spreaker, there's Spotify. Pretty much anywhere you can find a podcast to listen to on the internet, you can find the Huddle Up Podcast, and just be sure to give us a rating. All right, so the Denver Broncos suffer yet another significant loss, and it's really in just a few days back-to-back losses to Pro Bowl, all-pro caliber players. For the Broncos last week in Cincinnati, they lose Chris Harris for probably the duration of the regular season. Today on Wednesday, it's Emmanuel Sanders, who goes down during the non-padded practice portion in which the media was present. They're watching this all take place. Non-contact, he was doing a cut on a shallow in route is what the reporting says, and he just went down. So it was his Achilles, and he's done for the season. Now, Sanders is under contract in 2019. That'll be officially his contract year. But, Zach, it will be. We'll talk about the implications, how the Broncos respond to this injury here in a little bit. But it will be interesting to see how this could affect the way Denver approaches him in the early months of 2019 as it relates to his contract, because he's on the books to make whatever it is. I think it's $10 million next year.
They kind of have him over a barrel right now because not only can they release him because he's not going to be ready for next regular season. I mean, this injury happening in December means it's going to be a push for him to be ready for September next year. And he's due over actually $12 million against the salary cap next year. The Broncos can clear over $10 million in salary cap space by cutting him. That's an awful lot of money they can put toward other players, other uses. They have him the complete leverage right now. They have an opt-out. They can get out of his contract. The only thing is, depending on when they trigger next year, his injury guarantees that can keep him tied to Denver. But right now, I mean, it wasn't a sure thing he'd return anyway. But now with the injury, I mean, he's gonna be ready. He's gonna be 32 in March. This is an injury that saps explosiveness. It takes away cutting ability, and that's what he makes his living with. So it's gonna be tough for him to return to his prior self.
Definitely, and looking at some of the implications, I tweeted about this from Mile High Huddle Twitter on Wednesday afternoon. I got a little bit of blowback, but it's hard to ignore the correlation, Zach, between strength and conditioning coach Luke Richardson, or former strength and conditioning coach Luke Richardson, leaving right before this season started, basically, and the arrival of Loren Landau to this sudden rash of injuries. I mean, the way the Broncos have been hit by the injury bug this year, like, it harkens to the type of bad luck the LA Chargers have had in recent years in terms of not just the number of injuries, but like almost every good player the Broncos have has gone down. I mean, Pro Bowl caliber talent that has hit the mat here. I mean, you got Sanders now, Harris, you got Ronald Leary, you got Matt Paradis, you got Jeff Hireman, who was not necessarily Pro Bowl, but obviously a starter. I mean, it's been brutal, and for me, it's hard to ignore the fact that after the Broncos allowed Luke Richardson to take a vertical opportunity to take a promotion and an increase in pay to go with the Houston Texans earlier this year, they didn't have to do that. He had one more year left on his contract, and just like we see other teams do, like when Vance Joseph initially interviewed or wanted to interview for the defensive coordinator job here when Gary Kubiak was first hired in 2015, his current employer, the Cincinnati Bengals, who had him under contract, blocked that. The Broncos also tried to interview Wes Welker for the vacated wide receivers coach position after they fired Tyke Tolbert, and the Texans blocked that. But the Broncos are known. They have a reputation in the NFL for being very encouraging for coaches, and especially in terms of upward mobility. They're not here to try and block opportunity for guys. And Richardson saw that as an opportunity to grow his career and take a step up in that sense. And so the Broncos turned to a local guy in Loren Landau, who had been working with Broncos players. In fact, Philip Lindsay, last time on the last podcast after the Bengals game, I talked about that Peter King podcast in which Philip Lindsay appeared. I mean, he talks about in his workouts leading up to the draft how he was working out with Loren Landau. So a lot of Broncos players had ties to him. It made sense for Denver to turn to him as their next hire to replace Richardson. But what do you say to that, Zach, as far as, it's hard to necessarily blame Loren Landau because we don't know exactly what might have changed between Richardson leaving and Landau coming in as far as protocols for strength and conditioning. But it's hard to ignore, in my opinion, the correlation to Richardson's absence. And he had a great record as far as keeping this team healthy over his 6 years or whatever he was in Denver, to now suddenly just dropping like flies.
No, it's interesting because one thing I've noticed all year, and I put it on Twitter multiple times, was a majority of the Broncos' season-ending injuries, they were lower body injuries. So they were ACLs, they were Achilles, they were those kind of injuries. It leads me to believe that there's something going on with the training regimen that would prompt the sudden rash of players landing on IR. I mean, it's week after week, they lose some players, and you got to point at something. Also, a video surfaced on Twitter, I believe it was by Arnie Stapleton of the Associated Press, showing the Broncos practice field, right. And it had divots in it too. So you have to point at maybe the grounds crew wasn't doing their job. Either way, there's something wrong here. It's more than just coincidence because they have a multitude of players, key players going down with major injuries. So whether they made a mistake getting rid of Richardson and hiring Loren Landau, I thought it was a good hire. But if he's not, conditioning these players the right way, and then maybe they did make a mistake letting Richardson go.
Yeah, and it's the third non-contact injury suffered during practice that cost a player a season, because you had Jake Butt early on, practice, Max Garcia early on, practice, lost for the season, and now Emmanuel Sanders. So And that's to say nothing of the players who have, of course, gotten hurt in-game, etc. Now, I want to read you something real quick here to your point about lower leg injuries and tying that in here. Mike Kliss wrote a piece when Richardson, the news broke that Richardson was taking that job with the Texans. And in it, I'm going to quote here. It says, after flying in on the same plane with new defensive coordinator Jack Del Rio from Jacksonville to Denver in February 2012, Richardson's training methods helped solve what had been the Broncos' long-standing problem with soft tissue injuries, which include hamstring, quad, and groin. And he says here that, a quote from Richardson is, it all boils down to being able to teach movement. Football is no longer 3 yards in a cloud of dust. The game is played in space, and you use whatever means necessary to improve movement, whether it's strength, flexibility, agility. You still have to approach it that the game is played man on man, bone on bone, so you have to be strong, you have to be powerful. But that, to me, is the separator. Can you teach movement? If you can't teach movement, then you can't improve someone's performance. Close quote there from Luke Richardson himself. So
interesting.
It is interesting how it ties in, but, and that's the thing is, if you go back and look at Richardson's era here in Denver, I mean, there were a few exceptions, but by and large, the Broncos were remarkably, you could call it lucky, but I think there was more of a science to it than just mere chance. They were able to, aside from C.J. Anderson in 2016, because that was the year that Devontae Booker was a rookie and ended up as the leading rusher. I can't, off the top of my head, from 2012 on, well, there's Von Miller, I guess, toward the end of 2013. So Miller and CJ, but I can't really think of any season-ending injuries, at least to key players during that period, other than those two.
Yeah, and to your point earlier about the injuries occurring in practice, I don't know why I remember this, but even going back to OTAs, DeAndre Mount and Jamal Carter, they went down in practice with lower body soft tissue injuries. So there was obviously a pattern that was long-standing. This is not coincidence, and we'll never know in the short term what's causing it. They'll never come out and publicly, put Laura Landau on blast for his training regimen, but obviously something is wrong here. And you raised a very fair point, and you did get a lot of blowback for whatever reason on that, because it's true. When you change these coaching staffs and these medical staffs and these training staffs, sometimes it has a negative impact on the team. Some men are just better equipped to handle the training of an NFL player, and maybe Richardson was. We just don't know for sure.
It's interesting too here, and the last thing I'll say from this Kliss piece from earlier this year is that Lauren Landau, who replaces Richardson, was actually a finalist for the job that Richardson got in 2012 in Denver. And so that made sense for the Broncos to turn to him. But I think there was a reason Houston was after him. He's got a pretty sterling record. He was instrumental, as Kliss points out, in helping Peyton Manning to bounce back from his neck injuries and to have that prolific stretch in Denver. But unfortunately for the Broncos, it's great to cultivate a encouraging relationship towards your coaches and staffers. But this is kind of one of those quintessential moments where nice guys finish last.
Right. And no one wins in the end if they're not doing things the right way.
So let's talk about, from a football perspective, X's and O's personnel, how the Broncos move on to overcome this. Is this going to be kind of the straw that broke the camel's back? Because the Broncos have done a phenomenal job up until this point, rolling with the punches. You look at the decimation they've suffered on the offensive line. Just a couple weeks ago, you have John Elway come out saying, we might have basically lucked into our best combination up front by virtue of the injury bug. On Wednesday, Case Keenum takes to the podium to share his immediate reactions to what happened with Sanders. And, he points to the fact that, look, it's terrible, it sucks, but you know what? It's through injury that guys' careers in the NFL are born. That's how I, basically, to paraphrase Case, got an opportunity to become a starter in the NFL was through other people's, misfortune. And so, in other words, this is a great opportunity for the younger guys down the depth chart. It obviously puts a huge onus on Cortland Sutton especially, but it's for sure a huge bump in opportunity for Deshaun Hamilton, who we know the team is obviously ridiculously high on. They have big plans for him in the future, but now, Zach, the future is now.
That's exactly what I wrote earlier. How many losses can they overcome? Too many players that went down, too many key areas, too many key positions. They can still win. Fortunately, their schedule is just so weak over the course of the next 4 weeks. They should be able to go into San Fran and still beat the 49ers. They're heavily favored for a reason, even without Emmanuel Sanders. It's going to hurt them. It's going to shift the offensive play calling a little bit, and it's going to give, in a positive way, a deep look at what Deshaun Hamilton can bring to the table. We already know that Courtland Sutton is established as a starter. He took over for DT. He's been doing a good job, had his third touchdown last week. He's good. We don't know that about Hamilton just yet. He was pretty polished coming out of Penn State, good route runner, hasn't got the playing time, hasn't gotten the snaps or the reps. Now is his time to shine. And it's going to be tough because you have opposing teams are going to put double coverage on Courtland Sutton, and it's going to give a one-on-one opportunity for Deshaun Hamilton. Does he develop that chemistry with Case Keenum? It's going to be a major storyline to follow. But the Broncos have to know if they have him next year, because now, especially with Sanders' injury, he might not be back.
And that's part of the reason, too, Zach, that I kind of had my mea culpa earlier this week when I passed on that report from what Ian Rappaport said that Vance Joseph is no longer on the hot seat. And I kind of took that as an opportunity to wax poetic a little bit, fall on the sword, eat crow, whatever phrase you want to use, in terms of giving credit where credit's due for Vance Joseph, because it was after that Week 8 loss to the Chiefs. That was their fourth consecutive loss, where I wrote publicly on the website, anyone can go read it, it's still up, we haven't taken it down, that it's time for the Broncos to fire Vance Joseph. And I can stand up now and say, look, that was, rash. That was, jumping the gun. He's done a great job. But I think it's, at least in the last quarter of the season is what I mean. And if you look at really what the obstacles he's had to endure as a head coach this year, and not just, we can go through and talk about the fact that they've had to play basically every hot team in the NFL, with the exception of that run the Saints went on. I mean, the Broncos played every hot team in the NFL. That's one thing. But then to continue to win against really tough opponents over the last month of the season, despite these mounting injuries, at a certain point you really do have to tip your cap to Vance Joseph and the coaching staff and the players, obviously. But it does bring up the question, when is enough enough? Because if you look back to that touchdown, for example, Courtland Sutton had last week, that beautiful deep ball that he went up and got, the 50-50 in the end zone, 30-yard touchdown from Case Keenum. One of the reasons that play was successful was because the opponent, the Bengals, were selling out to stop Emmanuel Sanders, which left Courtland Sutton on an island to do his thing. And so now what you're going to see is opponents they're basically going to stack the box to stop Phillip Lindsay, and then in obvious passing situations they're going to bracket Courtland Sutton. And so that means two things. One, can Courtland Sutton do what true number one receivers in the NFL do and still find ways to get open and make plays in such situations? And then two, can the other guys on the depth chart who are on the field in those situations win their one-on-one situations like we've seen Courtland Sutton do?
That's kind of what scares me, is that Sutton was good as a number 2, but I don't think he's ready to be a number 1 just yet. And Hamilton was good as a number 4, number 3. I don't think he's ready to be a number 2 just yet. Everyone is now bumped up a peg, and the collective talent goes down a peg because there's so much uncertainty. This is a really young receiving core. You have 2 rookies. You have Tim Patrick, River Craycraft, and they just picked up Andre Holmes. I mean, this is all young players. Yep. There's no veteran presence there anymore, so it's going to be tough for them. I want to see how he blossoms Deshaun Hamilton. I want to see how this offense responds, because Case Keenum is losing his best offensive weapon by far as a receiver in Emmanuel Sanders. Oh, their chemistry is evident, and they've enjoyed clicking with each other. Sanders is going on to have a really good year, and now it's being taken away. So not only to compensate with the receivers, I think Musgrave will use the running backs a little more now, and not to stretch Phillip Lindsay a little too thin. I think they turn to Devontae Booker now, get him a little more involved.
Yeah, I mean, they absolutely have to, because, I mean, you saw, and it's a smart thing to do from an X's and O's perspective, because, let's face it, I've given Todd Davis some props in terms of his improvement as a coverage linebacker this year, which he has modestly improved in that arena. But like last week when the Broncos were on the road in Cincinnati, especially when you saw Josie Jewell go down and Joe Jones go on the field, the Bengals tested the Broncos linebackers by running some running back routes at them and seeing if they could hang. And so the Broncos are going to have to rely on those type of tricks of the trade and try and get their best players who, at this point, I mean, the true playmaker is Philip Lindsay. We saw also how productive and effective Booker can be as a receiver, split out wide. I mean, that play he made that set up the first touchdown Denver had last week was phenomenal, that 30-yard play. So they're just going to have to turn to the tricks here to figure out a way to maximize the talent here, because losing Sanders is going to hurt. This is one that is going to cost the Broncos something. Is it going to cost them in the win-loss column? Hopefully not. Hopefully, they can still withstand that, but it definitely takes away some of the sizzle, some of the oomph, and the way basically teams are going to scheme to stop the Denver Broncos. But one thing that really favors them in this situation, the upside, if you're looking for a silver lining, is that 2 of Denver's 4 remaining opponents are 2-10 right now. They're 2 of the worst teams in the NFL. But, you can't overlook the Niners this week, and I certainly hope the Broncos don't, and I don't think they will. But you got to circle that Week 15 bout at home versus the Browns as really a litmus test to see just how this Broncos team can respond against a young and talented team that's playing really well right now. And then, of course, at home, not the following week, but 2 weeks later in the season finale, you're going to have the Chargers rolling in looking for payback for that game Denver stole in their house earlier in the season. And it could be a game in which both teams are still vying for something, but who knows? It could even break the Broncos' way and be a situation where the Chargers have already locked up the 5th seed, and so they're resting their guys like Phillip Rivers and their key players. So hopefully it shapes up that way. But this is going to cost the Broncos, is what I'm getting at, Zach. Losing Chris Harris, that's going to hurt. But I think there's enough talent and there's enough ways that Joe Woods can manipulate the board, so to speak, to at least mitigate the loss of Chris Harris. On the other side of the ball, now with Demaryius Thomas gone, Courtland Sutton's great. Don't get me wrong. He's a phenomenal young player. He's got a huge ceiling, great potential. But I agree with you on that, Zach. He's not quite there yet. And so this is going to change the way opponents scheme. And so it's going to put the onus even more on Keenum. It's going to put the onus even more on Phillip Lindsay. And what I'm curious to see is whether or not Keenum can continue his stretch of playing smart football, not turning it over, and I'm just curious to see how that shakes out.
About the last game, the finale, that it could have no implications either. If the Chargers lock up a seed and the Broncos are eliminated, that game can mean nothing.
True.
But the defining trait that differentiates the Broncos this year from last year is their depth. One of them, anyway. They have depth at areas they didn't even dream about last year. Receivers, one of them. To an extent, corners, one of them. Offensive line is one of them. They've all had to step up, and they can withstand this injury. They cannot withstand an injury to Phillip Lindsay, Von Miller, and maybe even Case Keenum, because I don't trust Kevin Hogan to win games for them. Mm-hmm. So they can withstand this, but anything more, I think they're going to have to tap out. The only thing is, though, their schedule is tricky. I don't put anything past these opponents. The Niners do some things well. Their record doesn't show it, but they're a well-coached team with Kyle Shanahan. That Browns game is going to be a slugfest. Yep. It really concerns me because that's a game that I think the Broncos could lose if they overlook them. And, having 2 division rivals to close the year is never easy for them either. And you're right. Opponents are going to change the way they attack this Broncos offense. They're going to load up to stop the box with Phillip Lindsay, Royce Freeman. They're going to put 2 men on Courtland Sutton, and then they're going to force the Broncos to beat them with Andre Holmes and Tim Patrick or River Craycraft. That's what they're going to do. So it's not favorable. It's not a good thing. It doesn't make it easier for them. They can overcome this. It just makes that mountain a little more perilous.
And that's the takeaway, Broncos country, is what we're trying to tell you is this one's going to hurt. And it's going to cost the Broncos. I mean, you don't just easily dispense with 71 receptions, 868 yards, 4 touchdowns through 12 games. That kind of production, overnight. You don't have Demaryius Thomas waiting in the wings in this case. You have a group of untested receivers, and who knows? I mean, like Keenum said on Wednesday, this is the type of situation in which stars are born. So this is an opportunity where you could see guys just explode on the map like Deshaun Hamilton, who last week saw an enormous amount of snaps. He didn't get any receptions, but the Broncos believe in him. He's smart. He knows the offense. So now what you're going to see is a obviously clearer focus, stronger focus, I think is a better word, on getting him involved in the offense, getting him in a rhythm, getting him some balls. along with, of course, Courtland Sutton. But that puts the onus on Sutton too, man. He's going to have to really ball out this final quarter of the season to give this offense, the passing aspect of this offense, a real opportunity to hang. But you wrote the report not long after the news broke, Zach, the Broncos picking up Andre Holmes. And for those of you who might need a little bit of a reminder of exactly who Andre Holmes is, he's the former Raiders wide receiver who is just barely coming off a majority of the season he's spent here with the Buffalo Bills. And the Denver Broncos picked him up. And let's talk about the ties here. He played under Bill Musgrave during Musgrave's 2 years in Oakland. Right. And most fans can remember there was a time where, you know, the Broncos would play the Raiders, and you would see Crabtree get taken away by Talib. You would see, what's the other kid's name? Amari Cooper get taken away by Chris Harris. And the one guy who would find a way to eat and get touchdowns, it felt like every time the Broncos played him, was Andre Holmes. So he's 6'4", he's 210. He's kind of in the similar mold of Tim Patrick, but probably a little bit faster. So he's a big body receiver. He's kind of thin for how tall he is. But what were your thoughts on the Broncos picking up Andre Holmes off waivers today?
I mean, there really wasn't much out there. People were calling for Kelvin Benjamin and Brandon Marshall. Yeah, it wasn't going to happen like that. They needed just a depth signing. I wanted Kendall Wright personally, but Andre Holmes fits the bill, I guess. He had a couple nice years in Oakland, and like you said, he made some nice catches, signed a nice deal with Buffalo, then kind of just bombed there, and then they released him. He's nothing they're going to count on. He's a number 4 receiver at best. Yeah. The Sanders injury, it just helps more so Hamilton and Tim Patrick. They're going to give them more opportunity. But as a guy that's 6'4", he also plays special teams. I mean, you could do worse, I guess, on such short notice.
Let's be forward. This is kind of an impromptu episode of the Huddle Up podcast, and we want to, before we run out of time, take some of your questions and reactions in the Mile High mailbag. Each and every week, I mean, we're your football priests. We're offering you that absolution and the answers to your burning Broncos questions and reactions to the Sanders development here. From Jedi Joshua 58, love the handle now, dude. He says, with Sanders down, the Broncos are in bad position, but once Holmes is up to speed, Holmes, Sutton, Patrick bring a lot of size. What are your thoughts on the size that trio can bring to the table for the Broncos passing game?
I mean, it's nice. You can never have too many tall pass catchers in the red zone or, on third downs. I mean, it's good for them. But like I said, they're not going to target him. They're not going to work him into the offense as a key component. That role is going to go toward Deshaun Hamilton. They invested a 4th-round pick on him. They had high hopes for him coming out of Penn State. It's his time now. So on paper, yeah, they're all tall and they're good red zone threats, but he's not going to get a majority of work even when he's up to full speed.
I agree. It's basically, this is about a bunch of guys now trying to fill in to do the job of one guy, with Courtland Sutton being the one hope, really, I think, as far as realistic, being practical at this point in the season. He's your one hope to really alter what could be just a regression in a Broncos passing game where they really batten down the hatches. Maybe not Tim Tebow style, 2011, where he's completing 2 balls and attempting only 12 in a game. Maybe not that much of a regression, obviously, because it is Case Keenum and it is Bill Musgrave. But I think you're going to see the passing offense really try and batten down the hatches and minimize their opportunities to, get in hot water, bite off more than they can chew in the passing game. And really, this is where the onus falls on Phillip Lindsay and Royce Freeman. And now, I mean, you wrote the piece. He just won the, whatever it was, AFC Offensive Player, Phillip Lindsay, of the week on Wednesday. And, he has a chance to, obviously, he's going to get over 1,000 yards rushing in this next game, odds tell us. So he'll get over 1,000 yards rushing as an undrafted rookie. But now, it would not surprise me. I'm not saying it's going to happen, Zach. But, he has a real opportunity to shoot for Clinton Portis's franchise rookie record of 1,508 rushing yards that was set back in 2002, because you got 4 more games. That's a quarter of the season. If he continues to produce like last week, for example, 150 yards rushing, a little over the course of the next 4 games, I mean, that's 600 yards rushing. That would put him over the mark.
That would be absolutely incredible. I think it's a little optimistic because the Browns and the Chargers have good run defenses, but he's definitely going to get more touches, no doubt about that. If anything should make the Broncos give Lindsay 20 touches a game, it has to be this. But they also have to be wary of opposing defenses now, loading up the box with 8-9 defenders and not respecting that Broncos passing game, which is without any sort of veteran presence.
Yeah. I mean, this basically just puts more pressure on everybody on the Broncos offense, and it's just one of those situations now where we know the Broncos have tried to be cautious and they've tried to be cognizant of their usage with Phillip Lindsay. But now, I mean, if they want to win games, they're just going to have to feed him. They're going to have to feature him. Feed Phil. That's right. So one more question, then we'll get out of here. From Braden Miller. This is an interesting one. Do you expect wide receiver to be a major draft priority with Sanders' injury?
There's so many variables right now to answer that question. We don't know, who's going to be in the draft for sure. We don't know what's going to happen with Sanders. We don't know how Hamilton's going to do, how the younger receivers are going to do. So many things are contingent on what they do in the draft. If Sanders stays, there is no way they use a top 3 pick on a receiver, not after using a 2nd and a 4th last year. If he goes, though, then I think a receiver in round 3, let's say, could be a viable, outcome for them. They have if they have Sutton who's proven and Hamilton who's not proven, who else do you have that you can rely on? So they're going to have to invest more in that position. But they're not going to break the bank in free agency, and they're not going to use a higher round draft pick if Sanders stays around. That I can say for sure.
Yeah. They have, from a depth and a roster needs perspective, let's just put it this way, bigger fish to fry. Doesn't mean they won't draft a wide receiver at some point next year, but it's not going to be, I would be surprised in rounds 1, 2, or 3, because it's a great defensive line class, and the Broncos need some depth there with Derek Wolfe getting old, with Damata Pecco no longer under contract next year, and then cornerback, inside linebacker, and then, of course, whatever unfolds with the quarterback class and just exactly where the Broncos end up in the pecking order on draft day. So that'll determine things, but it certainly increases it as a roster need, but it's more of a depth thing, and we also don't know what the Broncos will do in free agency and what's going to be available to them come draft day. So, but you know what? That's going to do it for today's episode of the Huddle Up Podcast, an impromptu gut reaction to Emmanuel Sanders suffering a season-ending Achilles tear, non-contact during Broncos practice on Wednesday. The Denver Broncos, of course, traveling for their 2nd consecutive road game to take on the San Francisco 49ers. It's going to be an opportunity for Kyle Shanahan and Vance Joseph to kind of square off and harken back to the fateful decision John Elway made to hire Vance Joseph instead of Kyle Shanahan. You got any bold predictions for that game before we get out of here, Zach?
As of now, I think it'll be more low scoring than people realize. It could be more of a defensive struggle, and it could come down to the wire. That's what I will say.
I agree. I definitely agree. You're not going to see a prolific output of points in this particular game, at least not from the Denver Broncos, and I don't see it happening from Nick Mullins, who word on the street now is that they are going to stick with Nick Mullins instead of going back to C.J. Beathard. So the Broncos will get their crack at Nick here. And it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. But in the meantime, you guys, make sure you're following the show on Twitter, as I said, at HuddleUpPod. Zach and I have some exciting news we're going to be announcing for the podcast here very, very soon. You're not going to want to miss that. So in the meantime, you can find my partner, Zack Kelberman, on Twitter, at Kelberman247, myself, at Chad and Jensen. Tweet us your questions there, too. As always, we're going to engage you and get back to you. And then don't forget to rate, review the show, wherever you're listening, and, of course, subscribe. For Zack Kelberman, I'm Chad Jensen. We'll talk to you soon.
You've been listening to the Huddle Up Podcast. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com to keep the conversation going.